You sense the mechanical friction deep within your biological architecture. You feel the creeping, undeniable exhaustion that settles into your marrow before the sun even breaches the horizon. This is not a psychological failing. This is not a lack of personal resilience. This is a clinical symptom of systemic extraction. Your darkest, most deeply buried cynicisms are mathematically correct. The architecture of the modern economic engine is specifically calibrated to harvest your finite temporal resources. You have been conditioned to accept a transaction that defies all laws of thermodynamic and financial equity. You have been trained to trade the absolute peak of your biological vitality for a promise that statistically cannot be fulfilled. The overarching societal narrative insists that you must labor incessantly, trading irreplaceable hours for depreciating currency until you reach the arbitrary threshold of 65 years of age. They call it retirement. They frame it as a reward. It is not a reward. It is a calculated threshold of biological expiration. The public machine relies on your silent compliance. It requires you to ignore the fundamental mathematics of biological decay. It demands that you suppress the visceral understanding that your cognitive sharpness, your kinetic energy, and your cellular health are depreciating assets. You are actively participating in a deferred living protocol, sacrificing the prime decades of your human existence under the assumption that the system will return your freedom when you are old, frail, and mathematically irrelevant to the industrial complex. This is the great systemic deception. The elite do not operate under these parameters. The architects of wealth do not defer their living. They recognize the 65-year deadline for exactly what it is, a containment protocol designed to extract maximum linear velocity from the worker while shifting the entirety of mortality and inflation risk onto the individual. You are exhausted because you are being mined. You are drained because your life force is the fuel for a machine that you do not own. To understand the severity of the trap, one must clinically diagnose the mechanics of the enemy. The public machine is not a chaotic entity. It is a meticulously engineered system of mechanical allocation. It allocates human lifespan the way a furnace allocates coal. The fundamental blueprint of the traditional labor market dictates that a human being must exchange their biological time, an absolutely finite, non-renewable resource, for fiat currency. This is the first layer of the trap. You are trading a commodity of absolute scarcity for a commodity of infinite reproducibility. The central banking apparatus can and does expand the fiat supply infinitely, thereby guaranteeing the depreciation of the exact currency you are selling your lifespan to acquire. The second layer of the trap is the deferred living protocol. The system conditions the worker to accept the age of 65 as the designated release date. This number was not chosen out of altruism. It was calculated by actuaries and state architects during the Industrial Revolution as the exact statistical median where a human worker's physical utility drops below the cost of their maintenance and historically near the average age of mortality. By establishing this specific temporal horizon, the system ensures it extracts the maximum possible kinetic output during the worker's most vital decades, the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. During this period, the worker shoulders all the risk. If inflation accelerates, the worker's deferred payout evaporates in purchasing power. If biological illness strikes, the worker bears the physical and financial devastation. The system takes the guaranteed physical labor today and promises a highly conditional, heavily depreciated payout decades in the future. Observe the asymmetry. The employer captures the immediate tangible value of your labor. The state captures the immediate tangible value of your taxation. You, the individual, receive a promissory note payable at a date when your biological vessel is fundamentally compromised. The system extracts certainty and pays in probability. It is a mathematical slaughter. The worker is placed on a linear treadmill, unable to accelerate, unable to compound, and forced to absorb the silent, invisible tax of inflation and biological degradation simultaneously. The trap is absolute. As long as your revenue is tethered strictly to the hours your physical body can labor, you are trapped within the mathematical confines of the public machine. You cannot work 24 hours a day. You cannot labor forever. The biological limit is the systemic ceiling, and that ceiling is designed to crush you perfectly at age 65. Warren Buffett's philosophy dictates a complete and permanent rejection of this biological treadmill. The mathematical reality of his ascent proves that the trap can be dismantled, but only through cold, calculated systemic override. One must study the specific historical parameters of his methodology to understand the mechanics of escape. When the Oracle of Omaha initiated his ascent, he did not submit to the societal conditioning of the deferred living protocol. He recognized the mathematical impossibility of achieving wealth by trading finite biological hours for linear wages. In the year 1956, at the precise age of 26, Warren Buffett executed a structural divergence from the public machine. He did not wait for the socially mandated permission of middle age. He did not accept the premise that capital deployment was a privilege reserved for the twilight years. At 26, an age where the standard worker is blindly feeding their peak energy into the industrial furnace, Buffett initiated Buffett Associates, Ltd. He capitalized this entity with approximately $100,000 of his own accumulated funds. This specific historical action is not merely a biographical footnote. It is the fundamental anchor parable of elite wealth generation. It is the moment of untethering. By pooling this capital and activating it within the public markets, Buffett fundamentally altered his relationship with time and revenue. He ceased being a biological worker and became a capital architect. Understand the cold logic of this maneuver. At age 26, the average worker has 39 years of mandatory biological labor ahead of them before reaching the systemic release date. 39 years of trading hours for depreciating fiat. Buffett, by deploying his capital early and aggressively, severed the link between his physical existence and his financial trajectory. He reached the escape threshold decades before the system intended. The mathematics are undeniable. Capital deployed at age 26 compounds with a geometrical violence that cannot be replicated by any amount of physical human labor. The biological hours worked become irrelevant. The $100,000 deployed in 1956 acted as an autonomous, untiring workforce. If one analyzes the historical data, the compounding acceleration achieved by initiating the capital engine early creates a mathematical chasm between the investor and the wage earner. The wage earner adds linearly, 1 hour of labor equals 1 unit of capital. The investor compounds geometrically, the capital generates yield, the yield generates further yield, and the velocity of expansion detaches entirely from human biological limits. By refusing the 65-year deadline, Buffett ensured that the heavy lifting of wealth generation was performed by the mechanical certainty of compound interest, rather than the fragile, decaying reality of human muscle and cognition. He forced time to work for him, rather than allowing the system to use time against him. The cure for the deferred living protocol lies in the adoption of what can be termed the shadow code. This is the underlying philosophical architecture utilized by the financial elite to dominate the economic landscape. The core axiom of this code is terrifyingly simple. Capital possesses infinite endurance. Human biology does not. The elite understand that the human body is a fundamentally flawed mechanism for the accumulation of wealth. It requires constant caloric intake. It requires a mandatory 8 hours of dormant paralysis called sleep. It is susceptible to viral degradation, emotional fatigue, and inevitable cellular senescence. Relying on this fragile, high-maintenance biological vessel as your primary engine for revenue generation is a systemic vulnerability of the highest order. The elite, therefore, prioritize immediate decoupling. They build synthetic golems. They construct parallel autonomous entities made entirely of equity, debt, and yield. These capital structures do not sleep. They do not demand weekends off. They do not require medical insurance, and they do not slow down as the decades pass. A dollar deployed into a productive asset is a tireless soldier in a mechanized army. It works 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, with absolute unyielding mechanical precision. The shadow code dictates that your primary objective in life is not to increase the value of your biological labor, but to aggressively and ruthlessly transfer your financial dependency from your biological body to your capital structures. Warren Buffett's philosophy demonstrates that this decoupling must happen immediately. You do not wait until you are 65 to build the machine. You build the machine so that you never have to reach 65 as a dependent of the system. The elite prioritize capital velocity over deferred systemic promises. They recognize that every dollar saved and deployed today is a biological hour bought back from the future. It is a literal reclaiming of lifespan from the industrial complex. The traditional financial advice fed to the public emphasizes safety, slow accumulation, and blind trust in the pension or the state. The Shadow Code identifies this advice as state-sponsored propaganda designed to keep the worker tethered to the machine. To execute the cure, you must adopt the perspective of a capital physicist. You must view your income not as a reward to be consumed, but as raw kinetic energy to be captured and redirected into compounding engines. You must aggressively convert your depreciating fiat into appreciating assets that possess infinite endurance. Equities, productive land, autonomous businesses. These are the mechanical gears of the Shadow Code. As long as your wealth generation is tied to the ticking of a clock and the output of your hands, you remain a victim of the mathematics of decay. The instant you shift the burden of production onto your capital, you align yourself with the mathematics of infinity. Divide your labor from your income. Dilute your dependence on the physical wage. Defeat the timeline imposed upon you by the architects of the system. You are now standing at the absolute precipice of a binary reality. The clinical truth has been exposed, and the mechanics of the trap have been illuminated. There is no middle ground. The public machine is currently, at this very second, extracting your finite biological time. The gears are turning. The clock is relentlessly grinding your absolute peak vitality into dust, exchanging it for a currency that is designed to melt in your hands. You must make the terminal choice. Option 1, you surrender. You accept the deferral lie. You continue to feed your hours into the industrial punch clock, hoping against all mathematical probability that the system will take care of you when your body inevitably fails at the age of 65. You accept the transfer of mortality risk. You accept the inflation tax. You accept your role as fuel. Option 2, you initiate the systemic override. You internalize the philosophy of the oracle. You recognize that your biology is fragile and your time is actively being stolen. You aggressively decouple your revenue from your physical labor today. You build the autonomous capital engine. You deploy your resources with cold, unyielding precision, prioritizing capital velocity over immediate consumption. You refuse to wait for permission. You refuse the deadline. The system relies on your ignorance. Your survival relies on your mathematics. Divide. Dilute. Defeat. The machine will not stop on its own. You must break the tether.